people would say to me, wow, look what God was doing. And my response was like, you know what? He could have just not let my daughter die. Like, thanks for that, God.
Welcome to the Run to the Hard podcast, where we're here to remind you that God doesn't promise us a life free from suffering, but he always brings healing and restoration on the other end. Our goal is to inspire you to face life's trials with courage and trust in God's plan. And oh yeah, run to the hard that God allows.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Run to the Hard podcast. This podcast was produced because my late wife, Michael, gave us the mantra of run to the hard, run to the hurt, for it's in the greatest hard that God wants to do some of the greatest work. Today's guest, I've known for a very long time, but Tristan Borland is no stranger to tragedy. And we've been chatting now for a couple weeks. I really wanted to get him on the program and just have him share his story. And so, Tristan, without further ado, tell our folks a little bit about how we know each other, and then let's just dive right in.
Well, man, we go way back, but it's just been a big gap in our talking. So it's been good to kind of get reconnected and hear each other's stories. But yeah, I played basketball for a couple years in college for you. That was a long time ago. I'd like to say, Curtis, that I've lost my giant leaping ability, but let's be honest, I never had that, right? I would like to say I jump quickly. I could get back to the ground much quicker than most people, but yeah, no, it's so years ago, basketball in college, and then here we are 20 plus years later. And yeah, it's been fun to get reconnected. So
yeah, more than 20. I think 24, maybe pushing 25. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a few years. So
yeah, a lot of life has happened between now.
But grew up in Ohio. Most of my family's still back in Ohio. After college, I worked at the college for a year, and then a friend of mine was doing missionary work down in Brazil, and I was young and single and trying to figure out what to do with my life. So I moved to Brazil for 6 months to just kind of teach English and serve down there. So I met my wife Jill in Brazil on my way to Minnesota, and we got married about a year and a half later, and have spent most of our married life up in central Minnesota. So Jill and I have been married over 20 years now, and we've had 7 children. So I was the associate pastor for 3 years up here, finished seminary, then took a break from up here, then served in the church in Michigan for a few years, and then came back, and I was the lead pastor in this community for about 12 years. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so that's a little bit of our story in a nutshell.
Well, Tristan, you get married, you're now in ministry, you're pastoring, you start having kids. You tend to have the same kind of kid over and over and over. Tell us about your family. And your
man. So I grew up in Eastern Ohio with 2 brothers. So it was a family of all boys. And so just, grew up in a very sports, masculine kind of reality. And so our first child was a baby girl. Her name's Jovi. She's 16 now. So she's doing great. Then 2 years later, we had another baby, and it was another girl, and her name is Tana. And then we had a third daughter 2 years after that, and her name is Maria. And then 17 months after that, we had a fourth daughter whose name is Sadie. And then we were expecting baby girl number 5 in March of 2016. And so, I've heard all of the jokes, everybody picks on the guy with all the girls. And but man, I will tell you what, Curtis, I would take a dozen girls. They're the best. Girls. When I'm an old man, they are going to take care of me so well. You know what I mean? Boys, I have brothers. We are totally neglectful of our parents' generation, so I'm going to have it good. So all you people who make fun of me, it's amazing. Girls are fantastic.
Oh, that's awesome.
But yeah, so our story, and the reason I'm on the podcast is we were expecting our 5th daughter. And so at the time, our oldest would have been almost 8 years old, almost 6 years old. Maria was almost 4 years old. Sadie was 2.5 or something like that. We were expecting our 5th baby, and we're about a week or 2 out from the due date. And so all the little girls are getting excited to bring in sister number 5 into the house. And some friends of Jill threw a baby shower for her. It's the 5th kid, so how many baby showers do you actually get? But just some of her friends got together. And so I took a couple of my older daughters down to dance class. They were in the little girls dance thing. And I ended up sitting at that night by a friend from our community. She's a teacher in this community. And she and her husband lost their oldest son when he was in kindergarten. It was a public tragedy. I won't tell too many details, but it was horrific and awful. And I didn't live in this community at the time. We were in Michigan, but we heard about it. We didn't know this family, but it was just the thing. The word traveled, and I had known this couple for now 4 or 5 years, and I ended up sitting by her, and I said, "Hey, there's that 5K that we do every spring in honor of your son." I'm like, "All right,
Yeah.
is that still on?" And I had been to that a couple of times. I started to ask her about it, and here we are at a dance class, and this friend of mine just started talking about her son. And she said, "Tristan, that I love that our community does this big 5K, but man, that's a hard day.
Sure.
It's just hard. You see everybody. What do you say?" I said, "Well, tell me what that's like." And she said, "I'll tell you what, Tristan, it's really hard because we are not the same people we used to be. Like, we used to be different, and when we lost our son, we're just not the same people. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay that we're different. And we're actually okay being different." She said, "What's difficult is the people who want us to go back to who we were before." And here I am. I'm just, local pastor, just like inquisitive. And I'm like, wow, tell me about that. So we're having this deep conversation at dance class. And she begins to cry. And she's telling me about her son. And it's been, I think it was 5 or 6 years at the time since they had lost him. And I said to her, I'm like, "Look, I don't want to be weird. Like, I don't want to make you cry. I mean, we're at dance class, and here I am just like probing this really, heartfelt, emotional.
Yeah, you want to.
I'm just like, "Tell me about this." And I will never forget what she said to me. She said, "Tristan, I cry all the time. So people don't ask that much anymore." And here I am. I'm a pastor. I've sat by plenty of people who are dying. I've walked with people in tragedy. And for the first time, I was like, I've never asked her about her son before. I've known her for 5 years, but I was always like, "Oh yeah, I know her and I know about the tragedy, but I don't know. I don't want to make her sad." And she's like, "I'm sad. Thanks for asking." And I felt like both grateful, but how it never occurred to me. And she said, "I love my son. I love to talk about him. It's other people who feel awkward."
Yeah.
And I thought, man, it just blew my mind.
Sure.
That was a Tuesday night. Later that night, our daughter Maria, our third born, came down with a fever, childhood illness, was sick. And we just kind of stayed home, watched her. She was sick for a couple days. And then by Friday morning, she started to kind of, she'd gotten over the fever, but she was just kind of lethargic. We weren't sure, like, it's just typical, right? Kids get sick, but she just wasn't bouncing back like normal. This was Tuesday night to Friday morning. So I ran to, I was mentoring a guy at Teen Challenge at the time. I ran to the kind of the town. I went and picked up some things for the church. I visited this mentee of mine. I just just like normal day, did a bunch of stuff, came home. We were doing a normal evening. Maria was just laying on the couch. And my wife, she said, she's just not bouncing back. And so we had a neighbor friend of ours who's a physician. So I said, well, he's out. It was snowing because it always snows in Minnesota. And so I walked down. He was out like snowblowing. He came over. He's like, "Yeah, hey, we're all family here." And he kind of checked her out. And he's like, she just seems a little dehydrated or whatever. And so we're thankful for him to come over and just look her over.
Sure.
And our older two girls and my wife and I were sitting at the kitchen table playing a game. Maria's still kind of recovering, laying on the couch. And she called out to me and she's like, "Daddy, I want to go to bed." And so I went over and I picked her up, carried her. She was sleeping in our bedroom at the time because we had a baby, expecting another baby. That's kind of how we roll. I was laying Maria into her bed and she gasped and her eyes rolled back. And so I yelled for my wife and my wife came and called 911 and my wife started CPR and I won't go into any other details of that night.
Sure.
But it was the most normal day, and our daughter died just suddenly, like just no sign, no idea. And she was healthy, no like chronic illnesses. And so that was 3 days after this conversation with our friends who had lost a child. Just to give the listeners like an understanding what she died of, she got a typical virus, like nothing unusual, it was influenza. But for whatever reason, for her, it attacked her heart and it became myocarditis. And at that point, what happens is basically your heart is shutting down, but there's nothing you can do when it gets to that stage. So for whatever reason, it's kind of like the 1 in 100,000 case scenario, right? It's like,
Yeah.
it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And yet for us, it was 1 in 1. And so, you never know. Like one of the things I said is like, man, you never know when the worst day of your life is going to show up. For me, it was just like so normal. Like everything was normal.
Yeah.
And you wake up in one world, and by the time you are going to bed, like nothing is the same.
And that's where we share that commonality of Michael and I are at our second year anniversary.
Yeah.
And she gets sick and she's gone in 4 weeks from another rare, and it's funny because it's a heart thing. She come to find out had bone marrow cancer, but then this weird amyloid proteins attacking her heart, and it took her quick. And there's no way to explain that to people. Some people have years to prepare for tragedy. You had 0 time. I had 4 weeks. Like it's just, there is no rhyme or reason. There's no way to prepare. And man, I remember when it happened. And obviously your college community was praying for you and your family. I remember seeing your parents. I can't remember where it was. I might have even been to the church in Ohio, visiting family. In fact, I think that's exactly where it was. And I got a chance to hug your mom and tell her we were praying for them, praying for you. And so we remember that day very vividly. And everybody's in shock. How can this happen? And nobody knows what to do.
Yeah.
The same thing that the lady's trying to tell you. What, 4 days before that?
3 days before.
What do we say? What do we do? How do we reach out? How do we help? And one of the reasons we even started this podcast was to just tell people it's okay to be weird. It's okay to be awkward. It's okay to just keep trying in any way fashionable. Man, we learned of that tragedy. And then I know you started writing, you started posting, you started, honestly, lamenting. And our hearts were broken with you as you lamented and poured out what you were going through. And just share a little bit about that, because I remember reading some of your stuff. And back then, I had never experienced a tragedy like this. And it was hard. It was rough. But you were my friend. You were one of our guys. And I remember like forcing myself to read this stuff, right? No, seriously.
I'm very sympathetic to that. No, like I'm very sympathetic because like in some ways, that was 8.5 years ago. And we're really healthy now. We're doing well. And I just look back on myself and I'm just so unbelievably broken and despairing. And the writing stuff was very difficult. So we eventually took so one of the reasons we wrote, like I was a pastor and we had like hundreds and hundreds of people, and it was a public situation. When you lose a 4-year-old daughter, like everybody wants to know what's going on. And so there was even a little bit of a panic of like, what happened, because we didn't know. It takes a month for the autopsy to come back. So people were thinking like, is this meningitis? People didn't know. One of our other daughters like got a fever the next day. And you're not going to make me cry, Curtis. No, I cry all the time, right?
It's what we do. It's what we do.
We rushed to the hospital in just such a panic, and just like, and she got better. It was fine. But like, how do you go through having a daughter die in your arms to another daughter getting sick and not knowing? It's just like everything shattered. So we wrote, and we wrote for, I think I started writing like probably 3-4 weeks after she died, after the funeral. We can go back and talk about the funeral.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just, I was trying to write like one, we had hundreds of people that wanted to communicate with us. And I'm like, I can't do
Right.
it.
Right.
Like, we took 3 months off from the church. The people at the church, I mean, they loved us so good. And we could talk about that too. But um, we took time off. I just couldn't handle people. I didn't know how to respond. And yet people wanted to know. So one of our ways was communicating in our venue of like, how do we process this? Why don't we make sense of this tragedy that's happened in our lives? As we just put it on paper. And so my wife and I began to kind of just put a blog out there. And we did eventually a few years ago, took a lot of that and turned it into a book. And I'm a terrible salesperson. So I'm always like, it's incredibly sad and horrible. You probably don't want to read it, because that is like most people's response. Yeah. I figured, knowing what you've been through, I figured like you'll relate to it.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody who hasn't gone through tragedy, it's just tough. Like, it's brutal.
It is.
And but it was, I feel like it's an honest window. And it's definitely one of the things I said. It's like, this is not like a pastor's book on how to get through grief. It's more of just like, hey, this is the reality of sorrow and suffering.
This is what day-to-day looked like. And that's exactly what I took from it when I read it, was that you're just sharing what you're feeling, what you're going through, the questions you're asking. And before we go too much farther, I do want you to go back and talk about your wife's pregnant. She's ready to deliver. Mm-hmm. Maria passes away. There's got to be a funeral, and just kind of talk us through some of that, because I know it was nuts.
Yeah. So Maria died on a Friday evening. Jill's 8.5 months pregnant at the time. One of the really saddest things, like, Sadie, our fourth daughter, is only 17 months younger than Maria. So she has no recollection of Sadie's birth, right? They're two like so close together. And so Maria was so excited to meet her baby sister, because she's almost 4, so she can comprehend. She knows what's going on. She's super excited. And she dies right before she's born. And so I think as a pastor and as like, I've always been somebody who wants to express myself and speak truth. And so like I went into, I want to honor my daughter. And so for me, putting a funeral together was like, I guess it was the one thing I could do. Right. So we made some videos but we live in a small community. And so we, like, the church that I pastor is a decent sized church, but it wasn't, we just knew it was not going to hold all the people that would come. And so the local high school was like, anything you need, we'll do it for you. And so I was really grateful for the district superintendent. And so it was spring break when she died. So there was no school. So they set up the whole gymnasium, hundreds and hundreds of chairs. Everything was like sets, music people. A friend of mine was in Florida at the time. He flew back to do music. And I invited too many pastor friends to help out. One of my closest friends from Montana came to help out. Another friend from Iowa came up, another local friend. So they're just kind of helping out. Everybody was really generous. And so preparing for visitation on the following Friday, and then the funeral was going to be Saturday. Friday morning, early in the morning, Jill's water broke. And so here we are, we're rushing off to the hospital to have our fifth daughter. And so this surreal moment, we're driving, 40 minutes to the hospital. And the first phone call we make is not to my parents, not to Jill's parents. It's not to siblings. It's not like celebratory. I called the funeral director. Yeah. And I was like, we got to postpone our daughter's funeral because we're having a baby. So Jill goes into labor, and this is our fifth time around, right? And Jill's pregnancies and labor and delivery, I mean, her labor and delivery tends to go pretty quickly. But this labor just lingered all day long. Like, I think, she's still in shock, that the grief physically just, it affects you so deeply. Yeah. And so labor and delivery. And I remember being in the hospital. It's just so sad. And, we're just trying to I know objectively I will come to love this baby, but I'm a dad. That normally takes me a little bit of time. Moms are bonding as they grow the child inside their body. And I'm normally my job is normally I'll take the next kid for a while and free you up to care for the baby. And Lucy was born almost a week to the time that Maria died. And so, she's healthy. And I just remember I didn't feel even a little modicum of joy. I was just like, I'm just glad she's here. I'm glad this wasn't another tragedy. But man, I miss my daughter. Like I don't know this baby, but man, my little girl. So we welcomed Lucy into the world, and then the school at the time tore everything down for the funeral because school was starting back up. And then that following Tuesday set everything back up, and we had the funeral Tuesday. And so so our book is called A Life After Death, which is like that's kind of our story. Like we had a death, and then another life came into our world.
How does your brain even process?
Yeah, it's just surreal. So
I knew about the baby coming, but I did get a chance to. And by the way, here is the book, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. But going back and rereading it, I went back to that moment, like, oh my word, I forgot that literally a week later you gave birth to a new baby, which is this weird scenario of the death and then a new life and then the grief and the joy. And I told somebody the other day that, any joy that we have right now going through grief is like this weird ball where it's grief and joy wrapped together, rolling down the street, going happy, sad, happy, sad, happy, sad, happy, sad. You can't control it either. It's just, and I can't even imagine.
Mm-hmm.
You've got this joy, you've got this sadness, and how in the world do you work through that? And I don't know if you want to share a little bit about that, but I know it took you some time. It wasn't just like overnight. It took some time.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we could probably say on this. I think we were so overwhelmed. And I'm not a guy who like closes my eyes to the tragedy of this world. I'm probably a little overly pessimistic, and I think as a pastor, like I was just never a guy who was like, oh, everything's going to work out great. It's like you walk with enough families in tragedy, and I was not naive, right? Like so, one of my first funerals in Michigan when I was pastoring, it wasn't my first, but it was one of my first, was a guy who was a little bit younger than me who had brain cancer. And I didn't know him that well, but I knew the family. And just like in my 20s, still pretty naive, walking with this guy who's younger than me who's dying. Mm-hmm. And you can't go through that stuff and think like everything's going to work out if I just pray hard enough. And so it wasn't naive, but like, man, when it hits in your family in such an unexpected and tragic way, it disorients everything. And so for me, you talk about joy and sorrow mixed. I think, sorrow and grief is just so overwhelming at first. Like you might have a little bit of joy, but it's all you can see is this tragedy before you. One of the analogies you'll hear grief counselors talk about this is like over time, the grief doesn't go away. It's like this big ball in your life. But one of the ways you heal is like, it doesn't go away. It doesn't get smaller, but maybe your life gets bigger. So it's not as overwhelming, So like if grief is this thing like right before your eyes.
Say that again because I think it's a really good analogy, and I've heard a ton. Going through this stuff, you hear a ton, but say that again.
Yeah, so I think the idea is like grief is like this huge thing in your life, right? This big ball, and it doesn't go away, but over time, as you find healing and health, your life gets bigger. So it's this big part. It's still a part,
but the ball stays the same size.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted you to say, because it's hard to explain that to people.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't matter what else is going on. That's still there. And it's still the same size. No, I think
right now, I mean, we're 8.5 years in, and as I tell stories, like I can't help but like cry. Like, I never used to cry ever. I cry all the time now because it's just like, it's just, I can't talk about this reality because I love my daughter. I miss my daughter still to this day. There's so much that I just think like, man, what if she were here? And man, there's a big hole in the middle of our family that is our daughter, and we still love her. But 8.5 years in, it's it's not all that I see. It's a part of our life. But we're like, if you came and hung out with our family, we're a very happy family.
Sure.
My kids are joyful.
Sure.
Like, I can talk about grief and I can weep with the best of them. But we're really, because our life has grown. We have a lot of joy. But initially, all you can see is this giant thing. Like everything, just constant weeping. Just how do you live, right? Like, and you get this, right? How do you make sense of anything? And I think that was part of our writing. But one of the graces for us is we got a bunch of little kids.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you want to just like lay in bed all day? Can't. You got to get up and
my problem was I laid in bed for 3 months. You talk about taking the 3 months off church. I did, and it was terrible. It nearly ruined me. It was bad. And I had to go through some serious processes to get back. But it's true. That's all you want to do.
100%. I can totally, if I didn't have my family, I'd have burned my life to the ground. Because there's a point in grief, you're just like, nothing matters. Like nothing else matters. I think for a while, it was so frustrating. People would be like, "Hey, did you see the game?" I'm like, "I don't care about the game. I don't care about anything."
And we're sports guys. We used to love that stuff, and it doesn't matter. I'm still a Michigan guy. I don't even know how they're doing right now. I mean, seriously, it sounds terrible, but I don't know. That matters.
It took me a long time to care about trivial things. So, which made me kind of annoying. Yeah. I'll tell you a funny story. This, I think, is in my book. It's like the one funny part. I think I do have still a sense of humor to this, but I was, this is probably like 4 or 5 months after, it was probably this summer. So, it would have been 4 or 5 months after Maria died. And I had our 4 daughters that were living. So, baby, and then the 3 other girls. And Jill was shopping for something at the mall. And they have these little play areas at the mall, like where you can set kids. And they just so I'm just like, I'll just take the kids down there. You do your thing. And I'm watching my kids and I'm holding the baby and there's 3 little girls and some random guy had a couple of kids there. And he goes to me, because this is the thing, right? All girls. He's like, "Man, 4 girls? You got your hands full." And I was like, sorry, no doubt. This is what I said. I was like, "Yeah, we did have 5, but my 3rd daughter just died a few months ago." And I was like, I was so awkward. I was like, "Sorry, random guy, just normal guy having hey, you got a bunch of girls." And I'm like, "Yeah, I used to have 5, but she died." Here's a giant bomb I'm going to drop in your life, you random.
Yeah.
But that's what I think. That it is funny because I can look at myself then and I'm just like, I'm so weird. Like I'm just such a awkward person.
Weird. I all the time. I just got it out there. I didn't even. I was like, no, for you, your daughter matters. My wife matters. Like, I'm not going to live and forget them and act like it never happened. Like, no, they matter. And I'm just going to say it because it matters to me. She matters to her kids. And so I've made more clerks, store owners cry.
Just because you're weird too doesn't make me not weird, Curtis. I think most normal people would be like, "Yes, you're grieving. You might not need to tell every random stranger your life story, right? Like, ruin the other father's day."
No, I've done it. I've done it a bunch of times. I was in a store one time and the clerk said, "I remember you and I remember your beautiful wife." And I was like, "Yeah, she died." And she was like, "What?" And she starts crying. And the lady behind me, I don't even know if she was back there, listened to the whole story. And she came up to me later in the store, was like, "I'm so sorry about your loss." And I'm just like, that's my life.
Yeah. It is. And maybe this is like, it's kind of funny at some level. Like there is a dark humor to, but we're laughing at the reality of in that. That's all you can see.
This is our life.
Yeah. And it is weird to drop this on random strangers. But maybe people who are watching this, it's like, honestly, when you got somebody who's going through major tragedy, you're not going to make them cry. You're not going to bring up something they're not already thinking about. Now, not everybody, my wife is very different. My wife is much more internally processing it. Like she needed to go and just be on her own. And so I do want to say, like, people are different. So my wife, like, it was hard to go out in public because she knew people were going to ask her, and she just couldn't handle. I don't know how to process this. And we live in a small community, so everybody knows. So for me, it was like going to the grocery store. I'm trying to get a gallon of milk. That's it. That's what I'm trying to do. And everybody knows us. And it was just, so, and I'm kind of the guy who's like, yes, let me tell you everything, because you're just so sad. But I do say my wife then just, it was just even hard to go to the grocery store for her for a while. But yeah, I don't know, but you love your wife.
Yeah.
I love my daughter. It is a result of our love.
Yeah.
That we don't want to forget. It's a reality. And so, I don't know.
Well, I was so attracted to the book for two reasons. One was, I never wanted to, I felt like grief was going to destroy my memory. And it actually did. I didn't know that you'd basically go brain dead after grief, but you do. Like, my short-term memory is just mush. But I was so scared of that I began posting and writing almost every day. And what I loved about going back and reading your book was I remember these early days. And you were talking about, her twirling in her dress and always wanting to wear her dance dress all the time. And you're trying to remember all these amazing, intricate details of your daughter. And I remember going through that process. I didn't want to forget anything. And I was just writing as fast as I could. But I went through, hope you don't mind.
No.
I went through and I marked certain chapters. I was like, I've got questions,
Yeah.
I remember you talking about Good Friday and Easter coming up and how you were processing the death of your daughter and the hope in the resurrected Christ. And I want you to unpackage that a little bit, because I have people who follow our podcast that they are stuck, Tristan. They're so stuck. We're never going to make sense of these deaths. They're never going to make sense. We're never going to understand. But there is a point, a spiritual point, that I thought, especially when I was reading about Good Friday and Easter, that you began to make sense of life and death on earth and eternity.
Yeah. That was actually, so Maria died on March 4th, 2016. And I think Easter was about 3 weeks later. I think that was about it. And so for me, I got through the funeral, and that was kind of like, that's something I can tangibly work toward. Right. And I was putting things together and I want to honor my daughter, and I want to speak to her. And I knew we'd have, we had 800 people there or something. And I'm just like, this matters to me. And then when the funeral's over, it's like, what do I do? What do I do? And it was approaching Easter. And so that's when I think I just started writing. I'm just like, I gotta figure something out. And so here we are approaching Holy Week, the most sacred dates on a Christian calendar. And for me, I just started reflecting on Good Friday. And so one of the broad things for me is I've always had a theology of suffering, I would say. So when you talk about this podcast, Run to the Hard, I think this is something that I've always kind of held on to, which is like, for Christians who think if you just follow Jesus, everything's going to work out. I'm like, have you read the New Testament? The New Testament says all kinds of things about suffering. Like, you in this life, you will have troubles. If you want to follow me, pick up your cross and follow me. And just reading through the epistle, Peter's epistle, he talks a lot about this kind of redemptive act of participating in Christ's suffering. And so it's like, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, look at the path that he walked. And so that's something that's always been present in my life as I've kind of walked with Christ. So for a lot of people, they go straight from death and tragedy to hope of heaven. And that was not my experience. My experience was, I want to look at Christ's suffering. That was the way I could make sense of my daughter's death, was by looking at our Lord's death. And so I think my first reflection was, it's Good Friday. Like, this is a Good Friday that I will never forget, because I'm walking it. And I am like, I think we can so quickly as Christians think, oh yeah, Jesus died for us. Like it's just, this thing that happened. And we almost turn it into this, oh yeah, that was good of him to do that. But you're just like, have you looked at the cross? Have you seen Christ in Gethsemane, like weeping, tears of blood? Have you seen his friends abandon him? Have you really contemplated the cost? And if this is God himself, then in some way he understands our tragedy. That was far more hopeful than just thinking of my daughter in heaven. And that's just kind of where I think I began to wrestle. Now, I do believe in heaven and I do believe in the resurrection. And so I don't want to gloss over that. But for me, it was like, unless you can reconcile the suffering, it's really hard to see hope. And so, which, I mean, like our book, and I mean, I haven't looked at this in a long time, but I've got a copy here, but it's definitely more on that side of things. It's not a super, it gets to hope, but it takes a while to get there, I think. So.
Right. Well, I think the thing that was so relatable as I read through this is that death changes us, Tristan, and you know this. Like, we never will look at the world the same again. It doesn't necessarily change our theology, but boy, it sure sharpens it. Like our theology begins to really dive deep into what the scripture really says about death, about heaven, about the resurrection, about eternity. Like, all of a sudden the blinders are off and it's like you can see things differently. And I know that's true because I read your book and I was like, oh my word, he's going deep. He's thinking deep. And I remember Michael takes her last breath and I remember begging God, is this thing really real? Like, is heaven real? Is everything I thought that I knew, is it really real? Like, what just happened right now? And it wasn't just a bunch of doubt. It was like, man, I want to know. I really want to know. And it took me on a different journey. And as I read through this, I hear that in you. I hear that search. I hear those questions, almost some doubt sometimes.
Oh, totally doubt. I think doubt, not in the sense of, I mean, I never intellectually lost my faith. I'm like, well, look, I actually took a class in seminary on the problem of evil, right? That's all we studied. So we read, I don't know, a dozen books on if God is all good and God is all powerful, why is there so much evil and tragedy and suffering in this world? Which is, I think, the hardest question for Christians intellectually to answer. It is very difficult. So on the intellectual level, I've already settled this question. But on a practical level, like, where is God? Like, right now? Like, even, I told that story about our friends in this kind of profound conversation 3 days before my daughter dies. And people would say to me, wow, that's pretty, wow, look what God was doing. And my response was like, you know what? He could have just not let my daughter die. Like, thanks for that, God. Like, I appreciate the deep conversation. I'm grateful for that. But how about you just let her live? Like, I'm sorry. That's like having a really interesting and profound conversation. Not that helpful when I'm burying my daughter. And I didn't mean that in a snarky way. I meant it like,
no,
legitimately.
I know.
Like,
I get it.
And not skeptically, but like, this is not simplistic and easy. And one of our second or third reflection was that Easter, wrestling with the resurrection. And my reflection was on, I understand Thomas. The apostles come to him and the apostles are like, we've seen the Lord. And he's like, really? Like, really? And people would call him Doubting Thomas. And I'm like, I get it.
Yeah.
And people will say, well, your daughter's in heaven. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? Like, do you think that's supposed to help me? Like, I do believe in the goodness of God. I do believe like ultimate hope. But what Thomas was hoping for and what I'm hoping for is not some sort of like spirit out there, somewhere where I have no access to her. I said, Thomas, man, I get it. What Thomas didn't want to see a ghost of like, oh yeah, I had a vision. Jesus came, he appeared, and he's like, I'm still in existence as spirit. He's like, I want to, unless I can touch him, unless I touch him, I, I don't believe you. And I'm like, I get that. Because you could tell me, like, oh, I had a vision of your daughter and she's okay in heaven. I'm like, yeah, whatever, man.
Yeah.
But I'm like, you know what I want?
Yeah.
I want her to come sit in my lap. I want to snuggle with her. I want to see her. I want to touch her. I want her here, not like a vision, not a spirit. Like I want resurrection. And this is the promise of the New Testament. And when Thomas thought it was too good to be true, like it feels way too good to be true. I don't just tell me about your stories. Like I want reality. And then Thomas saw him and I'm like, I hope it's true. I hope it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's good. There has to be a hope.
Yeah.
It can't just be a bunch of words on a page. Yeah. You said
It's a hope, but it's not an easy hope. It's not an easy hope, right? But I do have hope. Like God is good. I do believe that. But it's not easy.
I mean, for me, there's 5 kids that need their mom. I'm like, seriously?
Yeah.
And God's providing. He's making a way. It's a weird way. I mean, I'm helping I'm helping their dad raise 5 kids, right? How weird is that?
And that is, Curtis, like when you told me that the other day, I was like, man, that is beautiful. And man, that is a hard road, and praise God for that. But you're not her mom. You're not their mom either. It's like God will use hard things, but it's still like, man, it's still hard, right? And yeah, that's yeah.
You said something. I loved this. Because people say some of the weirdest stuff. You talked about people saying, she's an angel now, and you're like, no, she's not. In fact, she wasn't an angel here. I loved that.
At one level, I'm kind of a very sentimental person, but in another way, I'm not sentimental in the superficial kind of way. And so people would say like, these very kind of trite and people, just to be clear, people were amazing for us.
No, I get it. I know people, and some of them are good people. They're trying to help us, but sometimes they say things.
I'm kind of tough-minded, and so when people be like, oh, she's just like this beautiful angel in heaven, I'm like, did you meet my daughter? Because like, of my girls, Maria was by far the strongest willed. Most of our pictures of her, like there's very few pictures of her smiling because she's just like, yeah, take your picture or whatever. She just was, she was strong willed and pretty hard. So I wrote about that. I wrote about that partly to be like, this is a real person. Like, don't just use your sentimentality to think, oh, everything's great now. Cause I'm like, yeah, she was a tough kid. And, we struggled with her in that, 3-year-old more than any of our other kids.
Yeah. And I would say this, just reading through this, it stretches your theology too. It makes you ask the questions about, God's grace on children. It makes you ask questions about all kinds of things. But yeah, I thought that was funny. The spin that you took was, did you know my daughter?
So this is probably not the most politically correct thing, but we'll just roll with it.
It's all right.
Yeah. So
if you knew my wife, she'd be like, "Amen, Tristan."
Excellent. Well, so we discipline our children. We're pretty firm, but we're very warm and loving family.
Sure.
But normally, like it seems like there's a little phase from about 3 to 4 where they're just like testing your will and like trying to like discipline. And we don't do a lot of like spanking, but we will in that phase just enough to like when they're 3 and they can't fully make sense. Some of the time just to swat and like wake them up to, oh, they're serious. And we don't spank beyond really the age of 4 or whatever. And Maria from about 2.5 to 3.5 was just so strong-willed. And so we just knew this. She was just like kind of defiant. And I wrote about this some in the book of like her just kind of rebellious and like, you're not going to tell me what to do in these kind of struggles of will. And, we're so despairing as a family in the loss of her. And I said, my girls are like, so where's Maria? And I'm like, well, she's with God. Like she's with God. And what's that mean? I'm like, I don't know what it means. We don't know what she's experiencing. And so we still pray for her. And I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of this. And then I said to my girls, I'm like, well, she's with her father. Do you think he's given her a spanking yet? And everybody just burst out laughing. And I actually kind of thought, I'm a pretty good father, all things considered, but I'm not that great.
Yeah.
And he's a much better father than I am. And I disciplined her out of love. Maybe he has given her a couple of nods. And it just made us laugh. But it was actually kind of like, that's felt more like real human life than this image of her with angels and flying in clouds and all this stuff. I'm like, no, this is like true. And when people be like, oh, she'll just be this little angel in heaven. Honestly, I push back and be like, wait, do you think my daughter in the resurrection will be perpetually 4 years old? I don't think so. I think she's going to grow and develop. I don't know what that means. Right. She's not going to be stuck in this perpetual state of childhood. I wouldn't want that for me. No. There's so many things we don't know about heaven, and it's life. It's like life restored. And for me, trite things about heaven just weren't helpful.
Sure.
But thinking about my daughter getting a swift spanking from our Heavenly Father, that felt real. So
that's funny. I read that and I was like, that's hilarious. No, but again, we're different. We think differently now. We look at everything different. You said something in your book. You said the risk of love, risking loving somebody again. And I think if I remember right, you were talking about another child coming into this world and this risk of love. And for some people that may not ring true, or they may not understand that, but it's a real thing to a griever. It's even to accept a new friendship. I told you the other day that I started dating again. It's so weird. I mean, we cry all the time. She lost her husband. I lost my wife. We cry all the time. Cried last night, in fact. Yeah. But I remember those first couple weeks, and I was like, man, do I want to risk this love? What if it falls apart again, and maybe there's another tragedy? Can I go through this again?
Yeah.
And I read that title and I read that chapter and I was like, oh my goodness, help me with that a little bit.
Yeah. Mainly I'm stealing from C.S. Lewis. All of my good thoughts are pretty much just me stealing from him. But in his book, The Four Loves, he says something like, if you want to be safe, here's what you do. You just live for yourself. If you don't want to get hurt, don't give your heart away. Protect it and guard yourself, and you'll remain safe. You won't be hurt. In fact, you'll become unhurtable. But you'll also be, you'll be isolated and alone. So it's to love, to give yourself to another is incredibly dangerous. And if you love, you will be hurt. If you give yourself to others, this is the gospel. Christ's love is manifest in his suffering. He suffers because he loves. And if you have children, if you're married and you have a good marriage, guess what? One of you is going to suffer greatly in the end. It's just going to happen. And for us, when you have children, you don't expect to lose them. That's kind of opposite. But when you love, you're going to be hurt. So I think it's just the nature. But what's the alternative? And Lewis is just the alternative is even worse.
Yeah.
Be unhurtable. And so you give yourself away because it's worth the risk. Because this is what we're called to. This is what life is about. It is about giving ourselves to the other.
Sacred relics. Sacred relics. I read that and I was like, oh man, because you said in your book that you guys months afterward began to go through her things, figuring out what you were going to save for the other kids, what things you were going to store away. And I have to be honest with you, Tristan, I have a whole closet and a whole dresser that I haven't touched in 2 years. And I still haven't done the thing. And when you talked about months after beginning to go through her things, I was like, oh man, am I doing this wrong? Am I, you know what I mean? You start to have this guilt trip, like, should I have done that by now? Should I have boxed things up? And just the other day, I got to tell you the story because it's nuts. Quinny and some girls were over to the house, and one of the moms says, "Hey, just to give you a heads up, the girls are in Michael's closets dressing up. And before you see them, I wanted to make sure you prepared yourself and knew what they were doing." And I was like, "You're kidding me." And they came out full dressed, hats, clothes, dresses, boots, all dressed in mom's stuff. And they were having a blast. Like they were having a blast. They were like, "Take pictures of us, take a video of us." They did a little dance. And my heart was just,
That's, I mean, wow. But like, maybe that's them, right? Like, processing.
It was, no, they needed it. They needed it.
Something, when you have to be doing it wrong, I'm like, I don't know. Well, who knows? Right? I met, man, I talked to one grieving mom, lost her son years and years and years ago. And she reached out to me, and this was a few years ago, but she's like, it was like 15 years. She finally moved some of his stuff to the thrift store or something. You know, it's just like, for us, the reason we got to it months ahead of time is we have a big family and limited closet space. And so going through her stuff was like, we're shifting our girls around. And because we had girl, it was tough because like that was her dress. It actually was hard to figure out. It's hard to remember what was distinctly Maria's because most of it was, we are like the black hole for girls' clothing, right? It just like comes into our family and never leaves it. It just goes from one girl to the next. And so going through her stuff though was, you know, it was a few months, and then just that the chapter, if I remember correctly, on sacred relics, it was kind of contemplating like stuff, like things. And as a culture, we don't have signs of grief. We don't have things that it used to be. Everybody, you know, you'd wear black for a season, and you'd have these kind of physical signs. Like culture would be like, oh, they're grieving because they're wearing, I don't know, the grieving attire and these kinds of things. And so we just felt like there's so much physicality to grief. You feel it in your body, right? And so for her, it's like her clothes, her things. She's 4 years old. Like, what did she have? Well, is her clothes, and you smell her on the clothes, and just like that whole agonizing process, and like, what do you keep and what do you give on to the next girl, and what was distinctly hers? And like up in our attic, there's still a box, it's still there. I don't know what to do with it. You know, it's just sits and collects dust. And
well, my hope is that the girls will eventually kind of go through her stuff and pick and choose the things, and they have. They'll every once in a while, I'll see one of the girls walk out of the closet with a sweatshirt or a hat or something, and so they've begun to do that. But I think at some point we're going to have an actual event. You know what I mean? Of you know, hey, kids, what things, and even for the boys, I think it's okay for them to have something of their mothers. You know what I mean? Maybe it's a T-shirt, whatever, just something that they can keep. You said something though that made me think of another one of your chapters, which was sackcloth and ashes.
Oh yeah,
almost like I wish we could put something on to tell the whole world I'm a griever.
That became like, because I was just like, that awkward conversation I had with the guy in the mall. It's like, it would have been nice if he could have known just to avoid me completely. Like, oh, this guy's grieving, I don't want to talk to him. And then it's like, I think that would be really helpful, because then people that really want to enter in, they know where you're coming from. So for me, I just let my beard grow. So I had this like big, long, burly beard.
I remember. I saw it.
But it just kind of felt like people were like, you kind of look homeless. I kind of feel homeless. So there you go. Like it kind of worked. And somebody had made these little wristbands with Maria's name and her date of birth and her date of death. And it was in her favorite color, yellow. And I was like, I don't know if these are necessary, but they made them for people at the funeral. And I didn't take it off for like a year and a half.
Sure.
Like it just became, oh, this is a physical reminder. Or you talk about like her stuff or clothes. And we are embodied creatures. Like physical things matter. And so we felt it so deeply in our body. And it's like there are these physical things that we latched onto. And then over time, I mean, I don't wear the bracelet all that much, but every anniversary, it'll find its way back on my wrist.
Yeah.
You know, there are moments where,
Sure.
where it comes back out. And, you know,
Michael had hair scrunchies at the hospital, and I remember grabbing them real quick on the way out the door, and I wore it for quite a while. You know,
yeah,
just having something of hers on, and I think people knew what it was. You know what I mean?
yeah,
You know, why is a dude wearing a scrunchie on his wrist? Like, that's weird. You know, whatever.
yeah,
Didn't care. You know, I don't know.
yeah. No, I think you do a lot of weird things, but like actually it makes sense, right? It makes sense that we need things. We do.
Yeah.
And honestly, you know, we're 8.5 years out, so this has shifted a lot. And most of our writing, the book was published 3 years ago. Most of the writings were from pretty early on.
Sure. Yeah.
But even this, one of the reasons I wrote was because I want my kids when they're older to go back and read, because they can't handle this right now. But I'm like, when our daughters are in their 20s, and then they can go back and be like, oh yeah, oh man, that's what they went through. Because you want them to have some experience, but it's not their cross to carry right now. So you navigate that with their kids, and you give them some stuff, but I don't know. There's no rhyme or reason to a lot of these things.
Well, I have a friend whose wife passed away at 34 from cancer, and his boys were really young. And he's told me before, he says, my boys don't remember their mom. And I remember thinking to myself, man, I don't want these kids to forget their mom. And so I make it this point of, we talk about it on a regular basis. You know, we've got some things that we're going to do on a regular basis. We're going to visit the cemetery. We're going to do certain things. And like you said, this writing is hopefully going to end up in their hands where someday they're going to be like, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
There is this extra level of responsibility when there's young kids involved of like, it's part of our new job to help them remember down the road. I remember just feeling that burden, like, oh man, I don't want them to not know. I want them to remember. Oh no.
Let me say a really sad thing. I'm good at sad things. 8.5 years in. Now we've had a lot of time. I don't remember much. We wrote a lot because this is how the human memory works.
Right.
I have a hard time imaging Maria in my head other than the pictures that we have. And so like what I remember, and this is how like our memories are so frail, like we remember pictures, we remember videos. I remember things that I wrote, but it's been quite a while since I've had a new memory. And there's been a couple of times over the last few years where somebody randomly from our church or community will come up and be like, hey, this thing happened with Maria. And it's the first time I've heard it. And
Like
it's such a gift because she was just a little girl.
Yeah.
And so how many memories are out there? But so I've thought about this, and it's so sad. I'm like, I don't literally remember much of my daughter, which is a very hard thing to say, but she's been gone twice as long as she was here. And you can feel guilty about that, or you can try to work super hard to preserve something. And you do. But at the other hand, it's like, maybe it's a grace. Maybe it's a grace that, like, my children, I don't want this to be the life narrative for them. I want all of them to be like, yeah, you know, I had a sister and it's affected my life in ways that I probably don't even begin to understand. I know it affected my parents, but I've had a good life. And I've got other sisters and siblings, and our life is good, and it's not their cross to carry.
Sure.
And so, but I think that is a burden because I don't want my kids to carry this. I do want them to read the book someday, but that's more just to relate to like, hey, this is what we went through as a family. You don't know it, or you don't remember. You maybe remember bits and pieces, but the younger ones don't remember any. But yeah, I don't know.
Your wife wrote something. I actually marked it. Redeeming pain, and I marked it because I wanted to read it. It was really good. She said, instead of asking God to remove our pain, we need to start asking God to redeem our pain. I had forgotten where I had seen the phrase redeem our pain, yet it's a phrase that I've thought of many times this year. I don't want the pain to be removed. I need God to help me to bear it. I need him to redeem it. Man, I thought that was good. It's like, wow. She was in this chapter, she was talking about another family that had been through a whole bunch of tragedy, and she even wrote an email. And she wrote this email prior to the death of your daughter. She wrote to them, "My hope and prayer is that Christ may redeem whatever type of pain each one of us is experiencing these days to further deepen our relationship with God, further deepen our character, further deepen our relationships with one another, and ultimately bring glory to Him." She wrote that to one of your friends before this tragedy, and whew, it's good, bud.
I remember, I haven't thought about some of these things in a long time. These are dear friends of ours who, some of our closest friends, walked with us through a lot of stuff. Their little girl, they're a big family as well, a bigger family than ours. So I always feel like if you have weirder family, by the way, I don't even think I said this. We've had 2 sons since this. So we've actually had 7 children. So we had all the girls, but we have 2 sons. And so we've had 7 children. We've had 3 miscarriages. So my wife is literally, we're in the double digits as far as pregnancies. But as long as you have a few friends that are just slightly weirder than you. So this family has 9 children. So you always just kind of feel normal. Everybody's like, man, you're a big family. I'm like, well, have you met these guys?
Yeah.
But this family, if I remember correctly, their daughter had a heart defect, one of their youngest ones, and she was going in for heart surgery right about this time. And they were kind of like, it was very serious. And I remember the father just like, and this is, I think, where Jill's writing this. They had a number of things going on, a lot of stress, and then this thing with their daughter. So Jill wrote this and sent it to them. And then their daughter came through the surgery just fine, and she's doing great to this day. But like right at that, and then Maria died, just so shockingly. And I remember the dad just being like, I was preparing myself for, what if something happens? And then like, why did this happen to you? Just like, so good. And then I think that email came back from this friend of Jill's that she had sent that to, of just like her own words, in a different context.
Yeah.
And the idea of pain, like maybe this is a helpful thing. Jill and I talked about this a number of times. I remember Jill, like when it went from 2016 to 2017. And if I talk about my wife, that's my wife is far better than I am, by the way. Just she should probably be on the. She wouldn't want to be, but she's got better things to say. She's just like, I don't want it to be a new year. Like it just feels like it's more distance from her, right? And just like this weird sense of like, I feel sad and pain all the time, but like that pain is a connection to our child. Like that suffering is a connection to our love for her. And I don't want to numb it. I don't want to forget it. I want to hold on to it, not in like a masochistic, I want to suffer, but it's like there's something in the sorrow that is like connection to them. And I think that idea of like, I don't want my pain to go away. I just want it to be redeemed. I want God to use it in some way. And that's, I think, a more help. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, that's really good. In your book, you have a chapter called Being Uncomfortable Comfortable. Being comfortable.
Uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable, yeah.
And I'm finding that, just 2 years in, so true. Like our lives are different. They're never going to be the same. And we're never going to be that person ever again. And learning to be comfortable with this new mind, even our bodies, everything's different.
Yeah.
Unpack that a little bit, because I know you and your wife talk about it, and we'll work through it.
Yeah, I just think, I would say this, Curtis. I think I didn't feel normal for 3 years, and even normal became a bit of a new normal. Like I just think I don't think people understand how, especially when it's like just such a deep tragedy, how long it takes to kind of even just feel any type of routine. But I will say this: at 8.5 years, this is the exception. I come on a podcast and I can be very real, and I can go back there and I can cry, and we can talk about very hard and deep things. But this isn't most of my life anymore. Most of my life is pretty normal. And so, but for such a season, everything is uncomfortable. It's stereotypical, but like holidays are just the worst. Like, what do you do for holidays? Family gatherings, all the things. The first year, and maybe the first couple of years, it's just like, what do I do? Like every decision just becomes like a wrestling with, before you'd have just done Thanksgiving, and now it's like, who do I want to be with, and like, how do I prepare myself? Where do I want to go, and what do I do, and what's normal? It's just everything is uncomfortable. But then you do kind of settle in, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to make everybody else feel uncomfortable because everything feels uncomfortable for me. I just have to get used to that, and that's not the case anymore. Our life is not like, I would just say, like, our life's much more normal. The family events. I remember 4th of July. It was probably our first family event. March 4th to 4th of July. It was like the first time we went to a family gathering where it was like, hey, everybody's kind of together. And I just remember, these are people I love. They are good people. Just feeling like every one of them was looking at me thinking like, when are they going to be happy again? I hope they can just be happy. And I'm just sitting there thinking, I don't want to be happy. Like, if that's what this is about, I don't know how to do this right now. Like, yay, it's 4th of July. Let's have a hamburger and a hot dog. I'm like, I don't want to be here. I don't know. I don't know how to pretend. I don't know how to be normal. The only thing, I could play with my kids. And when I was playing with my kids, our little ones, I'm like, I will enter into their world. But you, other family members, I just don't have the time for it, and that's not there anymore. We get together and I'm not in the pit of despair and things are fairly normal, but that takes so much time. I don't know. That's my experience.
No, it's good. That's why we're doing this. We're trying to help people because so many people that are, that are listening in are grievers. They're real grievers. I mean, some of them are really recent and they have no idea what's ahead of them. They're just trying to put one foot in front of the other. And so that's why we're doing this. We're trying to give some people some insight, but ultimately we're trying to give some hope. And you talk about that in your book. If you're not a griever, this book's going to be depressing right up front. But it's by Tristan Borland and his wife Jill, A Life After Death, a struggle to live after the loss of a child. And, working at the college for so many years, we actually know a lot of people who have lost children. It's crazy. Former students, some employees, different things. And so a lot of them know about your story, but I do want people to know that this is available on Amazon and you can get it. And for me, it's weird saying a recent griever. I mean, it's been 2 years, but it still feels so recent. So much of this, I mean, it was good because we connect on a different level. Grievers understand grievers. We have an unspoken language. We understand what we're trying to say or thinking about. And so this was good for me just to go back because I've said a lot of things about grief, but there were some new things that I learned and you got me thinking about, especially theologically. I've been working so hard to better understand the fall. Sin enters the world, right? Death enters the world. So now death is a part of life, and that every one of us have a timeline. And it's hard. 4 years old. My wife was 43. I have a friend whose wife died at 34. And my wife used to have this mantra. She would say, hey, 83 or 43, when it's your time to go, it's just time. And we're all going to die regardless of what the time is. And we say those words, but until you've experienced it in real life, they don't really ring true. And you begin to see life so differently. And you begin to realize the urgency of pointing people to Christ because we don't know. We don't know. And I pray harder than ever for family and friends who don't know him. I proclaim it more than I've ever proclaimed it before. I live the mantra on my shirt sleeve now. I'm just almost fearless about where we're going. And this life is so short and eternity is forever. I don't know. That's the message that we're trying to proclaim. And I know you've been doing it for a long time, even as a pastor. And I know you've had to live it through the lens of a lot of other people, but now you've had to live it through your own lens. And I'm proud of you. I just want you to know that. I still get to be Coach Christopher. I'm still older than you, I want you to know that I'm proud of you, man. I'm proud of your family. I'm proud of what you've been doing, and I'm proud of your outlook of pointing people to the cross, even through tragedy.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it, Curtis. And yeah, it's life is full of hardship and suffering and joy. And one of the things my wife and I just like really try to embrace is like, it's both. It's not either or. I think so often we go through difficult things and we think, oh, once I get through this difficult thing, then I'll be happy. And then I'll be happy, and then I'll be happy. And it's like, no, like there is going to be very hard things, and there's going to be very joyful and good things. And those come together so much more often. Laughter and weeping, joy and sorrow, beauty and tragedy, they're not mutually exclusive. Right. And I think I knew that before, in working with people, and I've never been a like super optimistic, positive person. I mean, I encounter people some of the time, Curtis, who are like, oh, I don't think about death. I try not to focus on these things. I'm like, how do you not think about this? Like, you're literally, like, you are going to die. How do you not wrestle with like the big questions of this world and like meaning and purpose? And you might not agree with me, but how do you just ignore this? And so many people in our culture just do. They just entertain themselves. They get caught up in like whatever's before them. I'm like, man, there's so much more to live for, but you've got to be serious about these things. And in facing them, like, it's okay. Like there's still, like, I tell people all the time, we cry a lot as a family, but we laugh far more.
Sure.
Yeah. We have moments like these podcasts. I'll cry with my old friend here, but we can laugh too. And there's beauty in that. And God is, like I said, he's faithful. It is not easy, but he's good. So
he is.
So yeah, this has been good. Thanks for letting me come on.
I appreciate you coming on and doing this. And I want to keep catching up. I feel like we got a lot of stories to tell.
Absolutely.
But I want to remind everybody again, A Life After Death by Tristan Borland and his wife, Jill. And then I also want to remind people, our podcast is located on runtothehard.com. You can find it on all the platforms. And then many of you know that we've started a foundation. It's the Michael Foundation. We're trying to put boots on the ground and help families in grief. And we've already started doing it. And so any way that you can help us out, pass our podcast along. I can't tell you how many even recent messages I've gotten from recent grievers who have said, hey, a friend of mine sent me a link. A friend of mine sent me your website, and thank you so much for your doing. And so, Tristan, thank you for being a part of this. I know somebody is going to need it. And so I appreciate it. Thanks, man.
Thanks, brother.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. Guys, please head to ratethispodcast.com/RTTH to rate the podcast. And if you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. And finally, third thing here, please check out the details behind the Michael Foundation in the link below. We love your support on this foundation and helping families stuck in grief with financial expenses. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.